40 years. That was how long the car had been lying buried in mud and weeds at the back of an abandoned Kentucky farm. 40 years of people walking past, laughing to themselves and moving on. Nobody ever looked twice. Nobody believed the rusted shape sinking under decades of earth could be anything more than junk. But Owen Merritt, the one man who never laughed, saw what the entire world had missed: a number. A factory-stamped sequence pressed directly into the steel, certifying something no one expected. And when the truth finally surfaced, all that laughter became questions without answers. Follow now so you do not miss a moment. Owen Merritt's story will change how you see everything left behind. Owen Merritt was 38 years old and had spent most of his life working with his hands. His shop sat on the edge of Louisville, Kentucky, a modest building with a corrugated metal roof, stained concrete floors, and a front door that stuck every time the humidity climbed above 90%. There was no sign out front with a company name. There was no presence anywhere that anyone knew about. There was just the work, and the reputation that came from the work, slow and quiet and earned over 20 years of doing things right. Owen specialized in classic car restoration, the kind of labor that demanded more patience than skill, though he had plenty of both. He did not rebuild cars for speed or for showing off. He restored them because something about returning an old machine to exactly what it had been appealed to him in a way he had never been able to explain to anyone who had not felt it themselves. He had been a widower for 6 years. His daughter Grace was 15 and kept mostly to herself in the attached house while Owen kept to the shop. He was not a man who talked much, and his colleagues in the industry knew his name without particularly knowing him. He had no formal training from a recognized technical school. He had no framed credentials on any wall. What he had was a kind of knowledge that lived in the hands and behind the eyes. The ability to look at a piece of steel that had been sitting in a field for decades and read it the way another man might read a sentence. It was a Thursday morning in late September when the call came from a law office in Harlan County. A distant great-uncle named Harold had died without a formal will. The attorney explained that there was no estate to speak of, no savings, no conventional property, but there was a handwritten note found on the kitchen table, directed specifically to Owen by name. The attorney read it aloud over the phone. The note said Owen was the only one who had ever listened, and that the land and whatever was in the back of the property were his. Owen had met Harold exactly once, when he was 9 years old. He remembered almost nothing about the man except the sound of his voice and one moment from that visit. Harold had taken him by the wrist and led him toward the back of the property, and in a voice low enough that Owen had to lean in, the old man had said something he had never forgotten. "There's a day coming when you'll understand why I kept it." Sebastian Cole, Owen's closest friend and occasional shop hand, rode with him on the drive to Harlan County. Sebastian was the kind of man who filled silence with commentary, and on that drive he filled it with predictions. A leaning barn, maybe, or back taxes owed on land nobody wanted. Owen did not argue with any of it. He sat with his elbow on the window frame and watched the hills get steeper, and the only thing turning in his mind was the sound of Harold's voice from nearly 30 years before. The farm sat at the end of a dirt road that had not been graded in years. The house was intact but hollow-looking, its windows filmed with grime and its front porch sagging at one corner. Weeds had taken over most of what had once been a working yard. Sebastian stood at the gate and looked at it for a moment before saying that at least the scrap metal alone might cover the cost of gas. Owen walked the perimeter without speaking. He checked the barn, empty, roof half collapsed. He checked the shed behind the house, tools, a rusted cultivator, boxes of old magazines going soft at the edges, and then he walked to the far corner of the back lot where a wooden fence had rotted and fallen outward into the knee-high grass, and where something solid sat beneath a dense covering of vines and packed earth and whatever 40 years of weather had decided to leave behind. He could not tell what it was at first. The shape was too buried, too encrusted. He pulled back vines with his bare hands, broke off sections of blackberry cane, and pushed aside the packed soil at the base. What emerged was a surface, metal, curved, still holding a profile beneath the oxidation and the grime. He ran his palm along it without thinking. Sebastian came up behind him and stood quietly for once. To a person without Owen's background, it was nothing. A rusted shape in the dirt, too far gone to identify, too consumed by decay to suggest anything worth salvaging. But Owen did not see it the way a person without his background would see it. He saw the radius of a rear quarter panel that he recognized the way a man recognizes a voice in a dark room. He saw the roofline, just barely where the vines had not yet reached. He saw the proportions of the body, the low, wide stance, the aggressive slope of the hood, where a corner of it had pushed through the earth at an angle. He had seen that stance before, he had spent years with it. Owen drove back to Louisville and returned the following weekend with Sebastian, a pressure washer, a generator, hand tools, and enough patience to work without rushing. They spent 2 full days clearing and cleaning only the exterior, Owen directing every move like he was handling something that could not be replaced. The car emerged from the mud in pieces of itself, a door handle, the sweep of a rear bumper, the ghost of a chrome trim line along the flank. It was a coupe. Long-bodied, low to the ground, with the kind of blunt authority in its lines that certain American cars from the late 1960s carried and never quite repeated afterward. On the second afternoon, Owen lay on a piece of cardboard and slid partway under the cabin with a flashlight. He had peeled back what remained of the floor mat. He shone the light into the lower cavity of the firewall and found what he was looking for without needing to search very hard, because it was exactly where it was supposed to be. The VIN was stamped directly into the metal of the frame, not on a plate, not on an adhesive tag, pressed into the steel itself by the factory, during assembly, in a way that could not be transferred and could not be faked without destroying the metal around it. Owen lay there for a moment without moving. He took 3 photographs with his phone. Then he stood up, brushed the grime from his shirt, and walked to the edge of the property where the fence had fallen. Sebastian asked what he had found. Owen told him it was nothing yet. What he meant was that it was not nothing at all. Owen spent 3 weeks doing the kind of quiet research that never looks like much from the outside. He requested records. He sent queries to archives. He cross-referenced manufacturing data against what he had photographed. He worked late into most evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad, going through everything he had gathered and building a picture that was not yet complete but was becoming more coherent with each passing day. He did not tell anyone outside of Sebastian what he was doing, and he told Sebastian only the minimum. There was a discipline to the silence, not secrecy for its own sake, but the understanding that an incomplete argument presented too early becomes a different kind of problem than no argument at all. He had heard of Voss auctions. Most people in the classic car world had. Charlotte Voss had built the firm from a regional operation into one of the most recognized names in the American collector market, particularly in the Southeast. She was known for her precision, for her network, and for a manner of speaking that left very little room for interpretation. Owen had attended one of her firm's events years earlier and had walked away impressed by the organization and less impressed by the culture. The way certain people in the room talked over certain other people, and the way those decisions seemed to track along invisible lines of credential and connection rather than knowledge. He contacted her office by email and requested a meeting. He was given a slot on a Tuesday afternoon. He arrived with a printed photograph binder and a folder of research notes, wearing the same kind of clothes he always wore. Charlotte received him in a glass-walled conference room on the 3rd floor. Carter Hale was already seated. Charlotte's regular collaborator and one of the most publicly recognized voices in classic car valuation in the eastern United States. He was the kind of man who wore his expertise as a visible item of clothing, present in every gesture. Owen laid his photographs on the table one at a time and explained what he had found and what he believed he was looking at. Charlotte listened without interrupting, which Owen took as a courtesy. Carter picked up one of the photographs, produced a small loop from his jacket pocket, and spent approximately 15 seconds with it before setting it back down. The assessment was delivered with a polished efficiency that Owen recognized as the verbal equivalent of a form letter. Carter said that based on what he could see, the vehicle appeared to be a standard production coupe from the late 1960s, likely in advanced structural decay given its storage conditions. He mentioned clone vehicles, title fraud, and number transfers, common enough in the collector market to account for most cases like this one. Charlotte added that a VIN stamped into the chassis frame was not, by itself, authentication of anything, and that without a physical inspection by a qualified appraiser, she could not advise further. She thanked Owen for coming. Owen gathered his photographs and walked out. He drove home in the same silence he had driven there in. When Sebastian called that evening, Owen said only that they were not interested. What he did not say was that their certainty, delivered without once asking to see the car in person, had told him something useful. It told him that they had not really looked. And people who had not really looked were not a problem. They were simply a gap between where he stood now and where the truth already was. 2 days after Owen's visit, Carter Hale published a post on a widely read collector forum. He did not use Owen's name. He did not need to. The description of the encounter was specific enough that anyone in the room that Tuesday afternoon would have recognized it immediately. The post described, with mild amusement, the recurring phenomenon of ordinary citizens arriving at expert doors with ordinary cars and extraordinary expectations. He used the phrase barn find fever and ended with a line about how the hobby needed to protect itself from the confusion between sentimentality and value. The post collected several hundred reactions before the end of the day. Giselle Hartman, an automotive journalist for a national trade publication, read it that evening. She noted the name Voss Auctions in the text. She also noted, in one of the photographs included as an example, blurred slightly, but present, something in the lower corner of the frame that Carter had not addressed, and that Charlotte had apparently not thought worth mentioning. Giselle wrote nothing that night, but she saved the post and wrote Owen Merritt's name at the top of a fresh page in her notebook. Owen returned from Charlotte's office and spent one evening going through every piece of information he had accumulated, asking himself in the most disciplined way he could manage whether he had made an error. He was not a man who confused desire with evidence. He had spent enough years in the restoration business to understand that wishful thinking had a particular texture, and that it tended to produce work that fell apart when it met reality. He went through the data. He went through the photographs. He went through the timeline. When he was finished, he sat back and accepted that he had not made an error. He had the car transported to his Louisville shop on a flatbed, a process that took 2 full days because the frame had settled into the earth in ways that required careful excavation before anything could be lifted. When the car was finally in the shop and the doors were locked, Owen stood in front of it under the fluorescent lights and looked at it for a long time. The disassembly began the following morning. Owen worked alone most of the time. Sebastian came on weekends. There were no updates shared with anyone, no audience for what was happening inside that shop. Owen documented everything himself, each component removed, each surface examined, each notation made in a numbered binder he kept on the workbench. He was looking for factory evidence. Not the kind that could be retrofitted or replaced, but the kind that the factory itself had left without knowing it. Rubber date stamps on hoses, factory chalk marks on firewall brackets, casting numbers on engine components that corresponded to specific manufacturing runs. He found evidence on almost every surface he examined. The stampings were consistent, the date codes were right. The assembly sequence, as far as Owen could reconstruct it from what remained, pointed toward a production window at a St. Louis plant in the fall of 1969. A period during which a specific subset of vehicles had been built under circumstances that differed from standard production. What Owen needed and did not yet have was the paper that connected this particular car to those circumstances. He sent a formal request to the General Motors Heritage Center, attaching his documentation, his VIN data, and a detailed letter explaining what he was looking for. Then he waited. He did not have the luxury of rushing an archive. He kept working on the car, kept documenting, kept building the chain of evidence from the physical object itself. In the evenings, he sometimes sat in the shop after the lights were on and the tools were put away, and he thought about Harold, the old man who had spent decades on that land without a driver's license, with no practical use for a car, who had kept this one anyway, who had refused every inquiry over every year, who had turned away curiosity with a non-answer and a change of subject. Harold had known. Owen was becoming more certain of it every day. The answer from the archive came on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Owen had sent his request. It arrived as a fax, and Owen stood over the machine and read it twice before he let himself sit down. The records confirmed the existence of a broadcast sheet associated with Owen's VIN. The Heritage Center had located it in storage. The document dated from September of 1969. It listed the vehicle's assembly specifications in the sequential format used by the St. Louis plant during that production period, including the engine code, an aluminum block configuration that Owen had suspected and that the physical examination of the engine had not contradicted. The code corresponded to a ZL1 engine variant, a racing-derived aluminum block unit installed in a small number of vehicles during model year 1969. Primarily through a specific dealer order program that had since been thoroughly documented by the collector community. Every surviving example of that configuration that researchers had identified over the decades was accounted for and assigned to a known history. Owen's car was not in any of those records. This was what he had suspected but had not allowed himself to assume. The broadcast sheet showed a production order that had not gone through a dealership. It had not entered the retail distribution chain at all. It had been assembled under an internal plant allocation, a provision that existed in that era for a small number of vehicles to be built for factory employees under specific conditions, outside the normal commercial pipeline. Owen's great-grandfather had been a line worker at the St. Louis plant. The car had been built in the final weeks before the assembly line transitioned to new model year production. It had been taken home, registered once, driven briefly, and then, for reasons Owen could not fully reconstruct but could partially imagine, never registered again, never sold, never transferred through any channel that would have placed it in a collector's database. It had simply lived on Harold's land and waited. Owen set the facts on the workbench beside the car. He stood under the shop lights in the quiet of the building and let the full weight of it settle without rushing it. He had spent the better part of 4 months on this. The transport, the disassembly, the documentation, the archive request, the waiting, and now the thing he had suspected since the first afternoon in that field was confirmed on paper in the handwriting of an institution that had no reason to be wrong. He thought about his great-grandfather, a man he had never known, who had stood on a factory floor in St. Louis in 1969 and watched this car come together and understood what he was looking at well enough to take it home. He thought about the decades between then and now and about all the hands this machine had not passed through, all the databases it had never entered, all the auctions it had never appeared in. It had been waiting in exactly one place the whole time. Then he picked up his phone and called Giselle Hartman, whose name Sebastian had mentioned a week earlier after finding her noted in an obscure corner of an industry forum. An automotive journalist who had recently been asking quiet questions about a Voss auctions meeting and a car from a Kentucky farm. Owen did not explain very much on the call. He said that if she wanted to be the first person outside this shop to see the real documentation, she should come. He gave her an address and a time. Giselle said she would be there. Giselle arrived on a Saturday morning. She was in her mid-40s, with the kind of alert economy of movement that belonged to people who had spent decades asking questions in rooms where people did not always want to answer. She stood outside the shop door for a moment before Owen opened it, and when she stepped in and saw the car for the first time, she stopped walking and did not say anything for nearly a minute. Owen gave her time. He sat on a stool by the workbench and waited. When she finally spoke, she said that she had seen perhaps a dozen muscle cars from the 1960s in her career, and that this one did not look like any of them in a way she could not immediately account for. Owen nodded. He began laying out the documentation. He went through everything methodically: the VIN stamping, the component date codes, the assembly sequence reconstruction, and finally the facts from the GM Heritage Center with the broadcast sheet confirmation. Giselle had brought her own list of questions, compiled from technical consultations she had run with 2 independent specialists without naming the car. Owen answered each question without hesitation. When he was done, she stood up and walked back to the car and placed her hand flat against the frame above the firewall and looked at the stamping for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at Owen and said she believed it was real. Not conditionally, not provisionally. She said it the way a person says something after they have checked it 3 times, and it has not changed. That conversation did not become public immediately. Giselle and Owen agreed that the documentation needed to remain contained until a formal authentication process was in place. Neither of them said anything about Charlotte Voss or Carter Hale directly, but both of them understood that the longer this stayed quiet, the better the eventual exposure would land. The break-in happened 11 days later. Owen arrived at the shop at 3:15 in the morning, 20 minutes after his alarm system sent an alert to his phone. The rear door had been forced, not broken, but opened with enough deliberate skill to suggest it was not opportunistic. Inside, the car was untouched. But someone had made an attempt on the supplementary VIN plate inside the cabin, had clearly tried to lift it, had found it unmovable because it was original factory-bonded metal and not a replacement, and had stopped. More significantly, the area of the frame where Owen had documented the primary VIN stamping showed evidence of recent contact. Small scrape marks, fresh against the aged surface, the kind left by a tool pressed against metal without quite enough force to remove what it was after. The binder on the workbench was gone. Every printed page of Owen's research documentation, his annotated photographs, his component analysis notes taken. Whoever had been in the shop had not come to vandalize or steal the car. They had come for the paper record. Owen stood in the center of the shop and took inventory of what remained. The fax from the GM Heritage Center was at his house, kept there specifically because he had understood, without quite articulating why, that the physical document needed to live somewhere separate from the shop. Everything else could be reconstructed. The car was intact. The stamping was intact. The physical evidence had not moved. Sebastian arrived 30 minutes after Owen called him. He stood in the shop and looked at the open rear door and the marks on the frame and the empty workbench and said that Owen needed to call the police. Owen said no. He said that a police report would put the car in a public record before he was ready and that whoever was responsible was almost certainly counting on exactly that. A public record that would slow the authentication process, invite scrutiny of the ownership chain, and give anyone who wanted to contest the story a window to do so. Sebastian stared at him for a moment and then said, with the kind of resignation that came from 20 years of friendship, that Owen had already decided what he was going to do and was simply explaining it now. Owen said that was about right. He called Giselle before dawn. He asked her how soon she could have something published. She asked how much time he needed before publication. He said 1 week. She said she would be ready. Owen spent the following week reconstructing his documentation from source. He contacted the Heritage Center again and requested a second certified copy of the broadcast sheet confirmation. He reprinted and re-annotated every photograph from his phone's saved files. He rebuilt the component analysis binder from a shorthand notebook that had not been on the workbench the night of the break-in, and from it he was able to reconstruct the full record with enough accuracy to satisfy himself. Meanwhile, Charlotte Voss appeared on a podcast, a well-produced program with a substantial listener base in the collector community, and spent 20 minutes discussing what she described as a troubling pattern in the market. She did not name Owen. She did not describe the car by any identifying detail. But she spoke at length about the dangers of unqualified individuals presenting personal finds as discoveries of significant historical value, about the risk this posed to market integrity, and about the importance of routing all authentication claims through established institutions. Carter Hale reshared the episode the day it posted, with a brief comment about protecting the industry from well-meaning but misinformed enthusiasm. Within the collector community, the conversation was not difficult to decode. People who had been at Voss auctions the Tuesday Owen had visited, people who had read Carter's forum post, people who had noticed Giselle Hartman making inquiries, they connected the points without difficulty. By the time Giselle's article appeared the following Saturday morning, the context was already loaded. The article did not make claims. Giselle was too careful for that. What the article did was ask questions. Specifically, it asked how a determination of authenticity could be made about a vehicle that the determining party had never physically inspected, and it asked whether the public record of that determination might warrant review given that new documentation had emerged. It mentioned the Heritage Center by name. It mentioned the broadcast sheet by description. It mentioned that Owen Merritt, a Louisville restorer, had documentation available for independent review and that he had requested formal authentication from 2 recognized organizations. The article reached the collector community the same morning that Louisville's annual classic car gathering opened its doors. Charlotte Voss was the lead sponsor and the scheduled moderator of the day's primary expert panel. By 9 o'clock, before the event had officially begun, her assistant had received 14 messages from colleagues and clients asking about the piece. Carter's phone had received more. Owen drove to the event alone. He parked at the far end of the lot, carried a document folder under his arm, and walked in as an ordinary registered attendee. He found a seat in the 3rd row of the panel room and waited for the morning session to begin. Charlotte opened the panel with the kind of practiced composure that her career had required her to develop, smooth, assured, projecting a sense that the room was in good hands. Carter sat to her right. 2 other industry figures rounded out the panel. The first 40 minutes went according to plan. Then a collector near the back of the room, a man named Isaac Barrow who had been buying and selling muscle cars since the late 1970s and whose opinion carried considerable weight in those circles, raised his hand. He asked Charlotte directly whether Voss Auctions would be prepared to conduct a formal authentication of the vehicle described in that morning's article. He asked politely, in the tone of someone who does not allow for a non-answer without revealing itself. Charlotte said that Voss Auctions stood ready to evaluate any vehicle presented through proper channels and that an article raising questions was not equivalent to documentation proving claims. Carter added that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence and that the collector community had learned over decades to be appropriately skeptical. Owen stood up. He did not stand dramatically. He did not raise his voice or wait for silence. He simply stood from his chair in the 3rd row and said, with the same flat calm he used when explaining a compression ratio to a client who had not asked to be lectured, that he had some things he would like to place on the table. Then he walked to the front of the room. The folder contained everything. The certified copy of the broadcast sheet confirmation from the GM Heritage Center, enlarged photographs of the primary VIN stamping on the frame with dimensional annotations, a component-by-component date code comparison showing the assembly sequence against known production data from the St. Louis plant in September of 1969. A written request confirmation from both the National Corvette Restorers Society and Bloomington Gold, the two most respected authentication bodies in the American muscle car field, acknowledging receipt of Owen's documentation and scheduling a formal physical inspection for the following week. He placed each document on the table in front of Charlotte, one at a time, without commentary. Then he straightened up and addressed the room rather than the panel. He said that he had visited the Voss Auctions office with photographs and research and had been told, without a physical inspection of the car, that his vehicle was a standard production coupe with no significant collector value. He said he understood why that conclusion had been reached. He did not have a credential, and the photographs alone were not proof of anything. He said he had gone home and done the work of finding proof, and that the documents in front of the panel represented that work. He said that the only question remaining was whether anyone in the room wanted to look at them. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when something has shifted that cannot be unshifted. Charlotte picked up the top document. She was too professional to let her face do anything obvious, but Owen watched her eyes move across the page with a precision that told him she understood what she was reading. She passed it to Carter without comment. Carter held it for a moment longer than he needed to. He set it back down. Carter said that a document from an archive was a starting point, not a conclusion. He said that the authentication process existed precisely to prevent misinterpretation of archival material. He said that until the physical inspection was complete and its results independently verified, no reasonable conclusion could be drawn. He delivered this as a statement of principle in the tone of someone explaining something obvious. Owen nodded. He said that he agreed entirely with that principle. He said that the inspection was scheduled for the following Wednesday at his shop. He said that press access had been arranged. He said that if Carter wished to attend as an independent observer, he was welcome to. Isaac Barrow's voice came from somewhere in the middle of the audience before anyone at the panel table could respond. Barrow said that he had been in this business for over 40 years and that the documents on that table looked more legitimate than 90% of what he had been asked to evaluate in that time. He said that what surprised him was not the car. What surprised him was the process that had led to this moment, and that he hoped the room was paying attention to that as well as to the car. The silence that followed had a different texture than the one before. Charlotte looked at the documents on the table. She looked at Owen. She looked at the room. And then she did something Owen had not expected. She said nothing. Not a rebuttal, not a procedural statement, not a managed retreat into institutional language. She set the documents down in a neat stack, folded her hands on top of them, and said nothing at all. Carter attempted a recovery. Something measured about the importance of process and the long view of market integrity. But the room's attention had already moved. People were leaning toward their neighbors. Isaac Barrow was talking quietly with the man beside him. 3 journalists in the back row were writing. 2 people Owen had never met stood up and began making their way toward the front to look at the documents on the table. Owen stepped back and let them look. He did not explain anything further. He did not need to. The documents were what they were, and the people in this room knew how to read them. He had brought the work to where it could be seen. The work would speak the rest of it on its own. He found his seat again in the 3rd row, sat down, and waited. The authentication inspection took place the following Wednesday, as Owen had announced. Both organizations sent representatives, senior inspectors who arrived with their own documentation, their own reference materials, and the kind of professional skepticism that Owen respected because it was the same disposition he brought to his own work. The process lasted most of a full day. Owen stayed in the shop but did not hover over the inspectors. He answered questions when asked, provided access to every component, opened every bay, and otherwise stayed out of the way. Giselle was there as the sole press presence by prior agreement. She sat on a stool near the entrance and wrote in her notebook and did not speak unless spoken to. The final determination was issued in writing at the close of business that Friday. The vehicle was confirmed as a factory original 1969 Camaro assembled with a ZL1 aluminum block engine under a non-retail internal plant allocation. Every authenticated point of the physical record was consistent with the broadcast sheet from the Heritage Center archive. The vehicle had not been rebuilt, had not had its drivetrain replaced, and had not been modified from its original assembly configuration in any documented respect. The authentication bodies noted that this vehicle did not appear in any previously compiled registry of known ZL1 configurations, making it a previously undocumented example of a factory build that the collector community had long considered fully accounted for. Giselle's follow-up article ran 48 hours later. It did not ask questions this time, it reported findings. It cited the authentication organizations by name. The piece was picked up by 3 larger publications within the week. Carter Hale's forum account went quiet the same day Giselle's article posted. By the end of the following week, the account had been deleted. Carter made no public statement. Charlotte Voss called Owen on a Thursday morning. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. She said that Voss Auctions had arrived at an incorrect initial assessment and that she acknowledged that directly. She did not qualify it or contextualize it with explanations about common practice or institutional procedure. She said that if Owen intended to move toward a sale, Voss Auctions would be prepared to conduct the auction under full transparency protocols and with whatever independent oversight Owen required. Owen thanked her for calling. He said he would think about it. He did not say anything further, and neither did she. He did not accept her offer. Within 2 weeks of the authentication announcement, a curator from the Automotive History Collection at a Detroit museum had reached out through Giselle, asking whether Owen would consider a lending arrangement. Their interest went beyond commercial valuation. They were interested in the car as an artifact of a specific moment in American industrial history, a physical object that connected a line worker's life to a machine that had never entered the standard record. Owen met with the curator in person. They spent 3 hours at the shop, the curator moving around the car slowly while Owen explained what he had found and how. The terms Owen proposed were simple: a loan of the car for exhibition with ownership remaining his. The museum agreed without negotiation. Owen had one condition beyond the standard terms, and he stated it clearly. The interpretive panel on the display case was to include the names of both his great-grandfather, who had built the car and brought it home, and Harold, who had kept it. Not Owen's name, theirs. The curator wrote the names down and said that it would be done exactly that way. The shop felt different in the days after the car was transported to Detroit. Sebastian came by on a Saturday and stood in the space where the car had been, looking at the clean patch of floor where 40 years of something extraordinary had briefly rested under fluorescent lights. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked Owen whether he had known from the very beginning, from the first moment in the field in Harlan County. Owen thought about it honestly before answering. He said he had known that there was something worth looking at. Everything after that had been a process of learning what he was looking at. Sebastian nodded at that. It was the kind of answer that did not leave much room for argument because it was not designed to close anything. It was designed to be accurate. The authentication, the articles, the confrontation in that panel room, none of it had made Owen famous in any conventional sense. The story had circulated in the collector world and in the automotive press, and his name was attached to it in those circles now in a way it had not been before. His phone had rung more in the past 3 weeks than in the previous 3 years combined. He had returned some of the calls and not others. The shop had 3 new restoration commissions booked, and Owen was working the same way he had always worked. One thing at a time with attention that did not divide. Grace came to the shop one evening after she had seen the museum's announcement. She set her phone on the workbench face up and pointed to the name on the screen, her great-great-grandfather's name in the exhibition text exactly as Owen had required. She did not say anything elaborate. She said, "They put his name up." Owen looked at the screen for a moment and then looked away. He nodded once. She understood from that what she needed to understand. Giselle called him on a Friday evening, not for a story. She said she was done working for the week and asked whether he was interested in dinner. Owen paused long enough that she asked, in a tone that was more amused than uncertain, whether she had said something strange. He said she had not. He said he was trying to remember the last time someone had asked him that. She said she could call back if he needed more time. Owen said he did not need more time. He locked the shop and walked out into the evening with the same keys he had always carried. The street was quiet. He stood for a moment before getting in his truck and looked up at the sky going dark over the neighborhood, and he thought about Harold on that land in Harlan County. Old and still and certain in the way that people become certain when they have made a decision they can live with for the rest of their lives. Harold had kept the car for the right person. Owen had found the right place for it. And something between those two facts had the shape of a conversation that had taken 40 years to complete.